Welcome to Learning Race, a podcast about my racial journey. In this podcast, we will specifically be talking about the impact race has had on my education. Disclaimer, I am only a small way into my racial journey, and I still have a long way to go until I'm even close to fully understanding the impact race has on my life and how I can change my mindset to better understand race. When I was younger, I remember having very few people of color in my classes. Now, this didn't seem like a big deal to me at the time or when I looked back on elementary, middle, and junior high school, but this lack of diversity allowed me to develop a warped sense of the world when regarding race. Not only were there no students of color in our schools, but we never talked about race. It was a sort of taboo topic. I think we probably never talked about it because people thought it was uncomfortable. An article I found in the Washington Post speaks on why it is so hard for people to talk about race. It says that there are 3 societal barriers and 4 internal barriers that stop us from talking about race. The societal pressures all surround our desire to keep everyone happy and preserve harmony. The internal barriers that the article talks about revolve around people's desires to never be seen as racist. This is something that I saw in both D'Angelo's book White Fragility as well as in my daily life. I know that I have definitely wanted to make everyone feel comfortable when in a conversation, but when talking about race, it is very valuable to feel uncomfortable. I recognize this in our workshop about race. It is important to experience uncomfortable situations because it allows us to grow and change. This uncomfortableness never even had the chance to occur in my schooling experience because the topic of race was never brought up. I think a main reason for this was the lack of diversity in the schools I attended and the communities I was a part of. When I first saw this issue, I mainly focused on the lack of diversity among the students attending my school. But while reading White Fragility, there was a mention of the teachers white students have. D'Angelo says, "Now think of your teachers. When was the first time you had a teacher of the same race as yours? Did you often have teachers of the same race as your own?" She then goes on to say that students almost always have white teachers. At first, this seemed almost impossible. When I looked back on who my teachers were, every single one of them was white up until sophomore year of high school. This was the first time I think I really realized that the issue was even deeper than the students at my school. There was even a lack of diversity in my educators. Not only did I have no teachers of color, but I tried so hard to remember any teachers in my past schools that were not white, and not one came to mind. This is startling to me. I've recently started to reflect on this lack of diversity and the impact it may have had on my education and development as a young person. I realized that this allowed me to develop subconscious thoughts and beliefs about people of color that I did not know I had and did not seem to play a big role in my life. Because of this lack of diversity, I started to think of being white as the norm. If I had no interactions with people of color regularly, how many of them could there be? When I saw a black student at school, I immediately noticed their skin color, which in itself isn't an issue and is a normal thing to do, but the fact that it was almost a shock to see someone that was black in school shows just how little I was exposed to racial diversity. This so-called shock continued through all of my education and only started to lessen when I got to high school. It took me almost 15 years for this shock to lessen, and it didn't go away. When reading the book White Fragility, I realized that this was something many white people experience. My schools were not outliers. As of 2016, 82% of teachers in public elementary and middle schools were white, according to the U.S. Department of Education. This number was surprisingly large and really made me think about how widespread this issue is. I then came across a TED Talk by Melissa Crum, and she talked about the many negative impacts the lack of diversity can have on students, but there was one part of her talk that put these numbers and percentages of teachers into perspective for me.
I then began to look at teacher demographics and student demographics. So I looked at who's in this classroom, right? So we know that children of color have doubled in the last 30 years in the K-12 system. We know that 22% of children live in poverty. And we know that 10% of students in the K-12 system are English language learners. Yet, our teacher workforce remains predominantly female, white, middle class, and monolingual English speakers.
Although the schools I attended did not have a diverse student population, the information she brought up in her TED Talk about teacher demographics made me think about how diversity in the educational workforce is lacking. After gathering this information, I wanted to see how this same problem arose in the schools my parents went to. So I decided to talk to my mom, who grew up in a small town in Colorado. Thinking back on the schools you went to, did you ever have a teacher that was not white?
No, they were all white. We had no diversity. There were Hispanic kids in school, but no Hispanic teachers.
So were there any other students of color at your schools?
Only a few Hispanic students, but no African American, no Asian. Very, very white school.
How do you think this lack of diversity impacted you?
Growing up, you didn't realize what you were missing, but when I moved to Chicago when I was an adult and saw how much diversity there was, even in college there wasn't a lot of diversity, but once I finished college and got to Chicago and had friends who were different colors, different races, different things that I wasn't used to being around, it definitely opened up my mind and helped me understand it better when I had friends who were different. I think it seemed more scary and more, I think there was more fear, just not knowing what it meant because I wasn't ever around it. And the neighborhoods, we used to drive through Cabrini Green in Chicago, which was now it's totally fine, but it was, you have to keep your windows closed when you drive down the street because you could be shot. And so there was a lot of fear around people that were different. And it changed a lot when I spent more time getting to know people and not just being afraid of it. So I definitely think had I grown up around it, I would not have had that fear initially as an adult.
Now living here in Wilmette in a majority white neighborhood, how do you think this lack of diversity has impacted me?
I'm sure, it's a little bit different because we do have Evanston High School close by where there is more diversity, but I think at New Trier there's not a lot. But I do feel like starting in elementary schools, there's so much more education about it than I had growing up, that we had opportunities to interact with people of different races. And I think I just felt like there was more of an awareness in the younger schools, and as you've gotten older and more exposure to it, just being in the city, that I feel like the knowledge of what's out there has made it better for you than it was for me, but definitely different not having it around you on a daily basis.
This further showed me how large of an issue the lack of racial diversity is in schools around the country and across generations. A school should be a place that educates students on all aspects of life, including race. It shouldn't be hard for me to talk about race and racism because it is something that our entire world deals with, but it is still difficult. I think that we should have been taught at a young age that skin color is important because of the issues it has caused in the past and the issues it causes now, but that these issues should be something we are trying to change currently. In my opinion, the earlier this is taught, the greater impact it will have on people. If I was taught about race and how my race plays a huge role in my life and how other people's races play a large role in their lives, I think I would have a completely different approach to issues regarding race, and I would be able to come from a place of better understanding about these topics. I came across an article written by a graduate of the Harvard School of Medicine that talked about the necessity and importance of teaching about race to predominantly white schools. She talks about how teachers can get white students to realize how their lives have been impacted by race by simply asking, when or how have you thought about being white? When was the first time you interacted with someone who wasn't white? She then states something that directly agreed with Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. She says, this line of questioning can help young people recognize how their lived experiences might be different from those of people of color. I think that this recognition could have had an especially large impact on my life if I was asked this when I was young. I think that if this idea was put into my head at a young age, I would have a completely different outlook on race and its impact on my life. Because this simple question was never asked of me when I was younger, the first time that I truly thought about how my race impacts every single part of my life was this year, my junior year of high school. I recently listened to a speech that Obama gave in 2008 where he talked about race, and he touched on how the lack of racial diversity in schools can harm students' education. This part of his speech stood out to me specifically.
segregated schools were and are inferior schools. We still haven't fixed them 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And the inferior education they provided, then and now, helps explain the pervasive achievement gap between today's black and white students.
The schools that I have attended have been racially segregated because the ability to attend them requires access to resources that are much harder to get when you are not white. This is because of the disparities between the income of white people and that of people of color. Because the communities I live in are so expensive, a type of segregation has occurred in both the neighborhoods and the schools. This lack of racial diversity in all of my schooling has allowed me to develop a view of race that is incorrect. Reading this book has allowed me to reflect on this and start to make subtle changes, but I'm still a long way from being anywhere close to having a complete idea of how the lack of racial diversity in my schools has negatively impacted my learning. It may seem to people that race doesn't have an impact on my learning. I go to school, learn math, history, and English, and I go home. But it's the social interactions with people of another race, or lack thereof, that has had an impact on our lives. Because I grew up in a town that was majority white, I became comfortable and assumed that this was the norm. Recently, I have recognized this comfortableness that I have had my entire life. Over the summer, I traveled to Thailand. When we got there, I immediately noticed that I was in the minority race. It wasn't like I noticed after we started walking around the city. I noticed when we were boarding the plane. I think I knew the reason I was uncomfortable was because I was in the minority race, but I felt too ashamed to truly recognize why I felt this way. As I read this book, I quickly remembered my experience there and realized exactly why I felt the way I did. At such a young age, I was taught that being white was the norm, and I became comfortable with being in the majority. This seemed normal because not only was I just seeing it in the town I lived in, but I saw it in my school, the place where I was supposed to go to learn everything. Not until recently did I realize how large of an impact this has had on my life. It is something I take with me when I go into Chicago. It is something I take with me when I travel. It is something I take with me everywhere. It is something I feel ashamed of. When I feel this uncomfortableness, I feel bad because I know this isn't how I should be feeling. But something that I recently learned from our race unit is that this shame is something I need to leave behind in order for me to have progress when discussing and thinking about race. This is something that has been extremely difficult for me because I know the way that I'm feeling isn't how I should be thinking, but I am unsure of how to change my mindset when thinking about this guilt. I know that this is one of the first things I have to change, and this race unit allowed me to realize that. This unit also allowed me to realize how little anyone in our community, including myself, talks about race and its impact on our daily lives. When I think about this, it is sad to me that not only did it take 17 years for me to finally learn about it in a more formal setting, but also in all of my school, I have not once felt comfortable talking about race or even had the opportunity to do so. This is why the issue has continued to be such a large issue. If we as white people are unable or unwilling to talk about race, like I have been before, how are we supposed to change the issue? How can we change an issue if we don't even recognize that it's there? The answer that I have been able to develop over the last few weeks is that we can't. If we don't recognize that there is an issue, there is no way we can change the issue. And I think one of the most important places for people to start recognizing the issue is at schools. At the place where we should be able to go and learn about things that are important. At the place where it can have the greatest impact. And it needs to be taught young. When I was a child, I listened and observed and took in so much, whether it was meant for me to observe or not. I took in the subliminal messages regarding race and specifically regarding how each race should be treated and which race was quote-unquote favorable. My mind was so open to gathering information that if I was simply taught about race and the struggles people of color had to experience solely because of the concentration of melanin in their skin, I would have a completely different outlook on race. I wouldn't feel as uncomfortable talking about race, and I would also be able to recognize my privilege due to my race. I am glad that I now have the opportunity to talk about race in a school setting, but I wish that it was something taught throughout my education. I know I can't change that though, so I hope that this unit has given me the tools it takes to recognize my privilege and hopefully change the way I talk about and regard race in the future of my education and life, as well as the education of my children.